Bette Howland, who wrote 3 well-regarded books in the 1970s and early 80s, then faded from the literary scene, only to be rediscovered recently, died on Wednesday in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She was 80. Her son Jacob, who confirmed the death, said she had multiple sclerosis and dementia. She had suffered serious injury in 2014 when she was struck by a truck while walking home from the grocery store. 2 years ago, Jacob Howland, a philosophy professor at the University of Tulsa, wrote an article for Commentary describing a chain of events that led not only to a reassessment of his mother's writing, but also to the emergence of a decades-long correspondence Ms. Howland had with Saul Bellows, who he said was a longtime friend and, for a time, a lover. A public space, the literary and art magazine, which is making Ms. Howland's calm sea and prosperous voyage the initial publication of its new book imprint next year, printed excerpts from those letters in a portfolio of Ms. Howland's writing in December 2015. I think about you several times a day, Bellows wrote her from Italy in 1968. My silly mind seems to be finishing out the last stages of some apprenticeship, and you are one of the topics of a mature interest. They had a city in common, like Bellows. Ms. Howland grew up in and wrote about Chicago no matter what her subject is, Christopher Lamenhawk said in the New York Times in 1978, reviewing her book Blue in Chicago. Mrs. Howland is always looking for the bone and marrow of Chicago. He added, and always the prose with which she searches is arithmetical, nervous, self-questioning, passionate. You can't fall into step with her, because the moment you do she shifts her cadence and takes off for another part of town, another time, another thing about Chicago. Bette Lee Sotonoff was born on January 28, 1937, in that city. Her father, Sam, was a machinist, and her mother, the former Jessie Berger, was a homemaker. In 1956 she married Howard Howland, who would become a prominent biologist, but by the early 1960s they had separated. They were later divorced, and Ms. Howland was making her way toward becoming a writer. In 1961 she met Bellows at a writers' conference on Staten Island, and the letters her son found in a safe deposit box begin that year. I want to see you do well, Bellows, who was 22 years older, wrote her in August 1961. I believe in fact that you can go as far as you like in writing. But as a single mother with 2 young sons, she struggled, and in 1968 while staying in Bellows' Chicago apartment while he was traveling she took an overdose of pills, a suicide attempt that resulted in her temporary confinement to a psychiatric ward. As for writing, your writing, Bellows wrote her in July 1968, around the time of the overdose, I think you ought to write, in bed, and make use of your unhappiness. I do it. Many do. One should cook and eat one's misery. Chain it like a dog. Harness it like Niagara Falls to generate light and supply voltage for electric chairs. It was advice she apparently took to heart. Her first book, W3, named for the psychiatric wing of a Chicago hospital, was about the suicide attempt and its aftermath. It was published in 1974. For a long time it had seemed to me that life was about to begin, real life, she wrote. But there was always some obstacle in the way. Something to be got through first, some unfinished business, time still to be served, a debt to be paid. Then life could begin. At last it had dawned on me that these obstacles were my life. Ms. Howland drew on her relatives for her second book, Blue in Chicago, the story of a working-class Jewish family. That book was variously described as non-fiction, an autobiography, a series of sketches, a novel, and a short story collection. She rebelled at the idea of affixing a label. When people worry about whether something is fiction or non-fiction, they are worrying about how much invention there is, she said in an interview with Story Quarterly. They should be worrying about how much imagination there is. Imagination is the only way of experiencing life. There is very little invention in Blue. There is a lot of imagination. Her next book, Things to Come and Go, 3 Stories, came out in 1983. Johanna Kaplan, reviewing it in The Times, called it a quirky collection of 3 long stories by a writer of unusual talent, power, and intelligence. In 1984 milliseconds, Howland received a MacArthur Foundation Award, the so-called Genius Grant. But her literary output dried up. Jacob Howland sees the 2 things as related. I think the award may have sapped her confidence, he told the website Literary Hub in 2015. If people don't expect great things from you, it's easier to please them. But people expect great things from a writer who has won the MacArthur. After that, she wrote some literary criticism, but there were no other books. Reginald Gibbons, then the editor of the literary magazine Tri-Quarterly, published the novella Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage there in the late 1990s, though he said it took quite a bit of cajoling. She seemed doubtful of the worth of what she had done and of what she was doing, and she was reluctant to be published. Mr. Gibbons, a professor at Northwestern University, said by email. I told her how greatly I admired her writing, but for a very long while she held back. It struck me then, as it does now, that she was one of those remarkable writers who, with greater gifts and accomplishments than so many others, has little or no confidence in her own achievement. In addition to her son Jacob, Ms. Howland is survived by another son, Frank, a sister, Rachelle Sotonoff-Altman, 5 grandchildren, and a great-granddaughter. Ms. Howland's work might never have resurfaced had not a copy of W3 caught the eye of Bridget Hughes, editor of A Public Space, when she was browsing through a $1 cart at the Housing Works bookstore in Manhattan in 2015. The book intrigued her, and some digging eventually led her to Jacob Howland. A Public Space now hopes eventually to reissue all of Ms. Howland's books. Bellows, for one, knew all about waiting for some words from Ms. Howland to appear. A postcard he sent her from Italy in 1968 consisted of this plea: a letter, note, word, syllable, anything, love Saul.